January 17, 1945. A snow-covered forest near the Belgian-German border. The ground frozen beneath Wehrmacht boots. Colonel Heinrich Müller stood in a hastily constructed bunker, his breath visible in the bitter cold, staring at a single piece of charred paper retrieved from a burning Allied transport truck. The document bore no official stamp, no recognizable military designation, only a series of alphanumeric codes and a red classification mark he had never seen before. Ultra-cosmic. He did not know it then, but in his trembling hands lay evidence of the war's most dangerous secret, one that would remain buried in silence for decades, hidden not by accident but by design, protected by governments, intelligence agencies, and a conspiracy of silence that transcended victory and defeat. ***. The Second World War was not merely a conflict of armies and territories. Beneath the thunder of artillery and the roar of panzer divisions, another war raged in absolute darkness, a war of secrets, of invisible weapons forged not from steel but from information, deception, and silence. While historians have illuminated many corners of that great catastrophe, certain files remain locked away, their contents too dangerous, too compromising, or too devastating to release even 80 years after the guns fell silent. These are not the secrets of battlefield tactics or diplomatic failures. These are secrets that, if revealed in their entirety, would shatter our understanding of morality, collaboration, betrayal, and the true cost of victory. The winter of 1945 marked the war's final, desperate phase. Germany's once mighty Wehrmacht was collapsing on all fronts. Soviet armies crushed eastward through Poland. American and British forces pushed into the Rhineland. Yet in the chaos of retreat and destruction, a peculiar phenomenon occurred, a frantic, coordinated effort by multiple intelligence services, Allied and Axis alike, to secure, destroy, or conceal specific documents. Not battle plans, not troop movements, not even the locations of hidden Nazi gold or stolen art. These were files that documented operations, experiments, and collaborations so morally compromising that their exposure threatened to destabilize the very narrative of the good war. Colonel Müller's discovery was neither accident nor fortune. German military intelligence, the Abwehr, had been intercepting Allied communications for months, though with decreasing success as encryption methods improved. What Müller held was a fragment of something far more sophisticated than standard military correspondence. The codes suggested a level of compartmentalization that exceeded even the most classified Wehrmacht operations. His intelligence officers worked through the night, attempting decryption, but the systems were unlike anything they had encountered. The paper itself bore chemical watermarks indicating American origin, but the distribution list included Soviet designations and British cipher groups. An impossible collaboration. Or so it seemed. What Müller could not have known was that he had stumbled upon evidence of Operation Paperclip's precursor negotiations, preliminary agreements made as early as 1943 between American intelligence operatives and certain high-ranking Nazi scientists and officers. These were not defection offers made in desperation during the war's final days. These were calculated, long-term arrangements, meticulously planned exchanges of knowledge, personnel, and immunity from prosecution in return for weapons research, intelligence on Soviet capabilities, and technological advantages that would define the coming Cold War. The negotiations were so sensitive that they were conducted outside normal military and diplomatic channels, known only to a handful of individuals in Washington, London, and, paradoxically, within the upper echelons of the SS and Wehrmacht scientific community. The files documented something that contradicted the public narrative of absolute Allied moral superiority. The Western powers had been selectively cooperating with Nazi war criminals years before Germany's surrender, not out of post-war pragmatism, but as strategic preparation for the Soviet threat they knew would follow. The Americans wanted rocket scientists, chemical weapons experts, and intelligence officers. The British sought experts in submarine warfare and code-breaking methodologies. The Soviets, through their own clandestine networks, were conducting identical negotiations. The irony was profound and disturbing. While millions died in the Nazi regime's death camps, while soldiers fought and bled to destroy fascism, Intelligence officers from the Allied nations were already drafting immunity agreements for the very architects of that machinery of death. But Operation Paperclip was merely one layer of the concealed truth. Deeper, more troubling secrets lay in files that would remain classified for generations. Consider the systematic suppression of evidence regarding the Katyn forest massacre. In April 1940, Soviet NKVD forces executed approximately 22,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, and prisoners of war in the forests near Katyn and other sites. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 and discovered the mass graves in 1943, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine immediately exploited the atrocity, correctly blaming the Soviets. The Allies, however, faced a devastating dilemma. The Soviet Union was their essential partner against Nazi Germany. Acknowledging Soviet guilt for Katyn would fracture that alliance at a critical moment when the Eastern Front was pivotal to defeating Hitler. So the files were buried. British intelligence, American diplomatic cables, and even reports from the International Red Cross that suggested Soviet responsibility were classified, hidden, or destroyed. The official Allied position became ambiguous silence, and at the Nuremberg trials, Soviet prosecutors attempted to charge Nazi defendants with the Katyn massacre, despite overwhelming evidence of Soviet culpability. Western prosecutors did not press the issue. The files containing intercepts, witness testimonies, and forensic evidence were locked away, inaccessible to historians, journalists, or the Polish government in exile that desperately sought acknowledgement and justice. The truth would not be officially admitted by the Soviet Union until 1990, 50 years after the murders, and many of the original Western intelligence files remain partially redacted even today. The concealment of Katyn revealed a fundamental principle that governed wartime and post-war secrecy. Political expediency superseded moral truth. If acknowledging a crime committed by an ally threatened strategic objectives, that crime would be erased from the official record, regardless of the human cost. This principle would be applied repeatedly across multiple theaters and contexts, creating a labyrinth of hidden files that documented not merely the actions of enemies, but the compromises, betrayals, and atrocities committed or tolerated by the Allied powers themselves. Among the most dangerous secrets were those involving chemical and biological warfare research. While the world recoiled in horror at Nazi experiments conducted by Joseph Mengele and others at Auschwitz and other camps, a parallel program of equally horrific human experimentation was being conducted by Unit 730, one of the Imperial Japanese Army in occupied Manchuria. Under the command of General Shiro Ishii, Unit 731 conducted biological warfare research involving vivisection, deliberate infection with diseases like plague and anthrax, frostbite testing, and weapons development using live human subjects, primarily Chinese civilians, Soviet prisoners, and Korean laborers. The death toll is estimated between 3,000 and 200,000 individuals, with entire villages wiped out in field tests of biological weapons. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, American occupation forces under General Douglas MacArthur faced a choice: prosecute the scientists of Unit 731 as war criminals alongside their Nazi counterparts at Nuremberg, or grant them immunity in exchange for their research data. The United States chose the latter. General Ishii and his senior staff were given immunity from prosecution. Their research, bought with thousands of lives and unimaginable suffering, was transferred to Fort Detrick in Maryland and became the foundation of the American Biological Weapons Program. The files documenting this transaction, the complete research records, and the names of all individuals granted immunity remain among the most heavily classified documents in American military history. The Soviet Union conducted similar negotiations with captured Unit 731 personnel, though they publicly tried a small number for propaganda purposes while secretly employing others. The suppression of Unit 731's crimes was so complete that Shiro Ishii lived freely in Japan until his death from natural causes in 1959. Most of his staff resumed normal lives, some becoming prominent in Japanese medical and pharmaceutical industries. The victims received no recognition, no justice, no acknowledgement. The files that would document this moral bargain, this calculated decision to grant immunity to perpetrators of crimes rivaling the Holocaust in their depravity, remain locked in archives in Washington, Tokyo, and Moscow, accessible only to researchers with the highest security clearances and compelling governmental interest. There were other secrets, equally disturbing in their implications. The full extent of Allied strategic bombing's deliberate targeting of civilian populations remains partially concealed. While the firebombing of Dresden in February 1945 has entered public consciousness as a controversial operation, the systematic campaign to destroy civilian morale through incendiary attacks on Japanese cities has been less thoroughly examined. Between March and August 1945, American B-29 bombers conducted low-altitude nighttime incendiary raids on 67 Japanese cities, deliberately targeting wooden residential areas rather than industrial or military facilities. The attack on Tokyo on the night of March 9 to 10, 1945, killed an estimated 100,000 civilians in a single night, more than died immediately at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The heat was so intense that canals boiled, glass melted, and people were incinerated so completely that they left only shadows on the pavement. The operational files for these raids contain explicit discussions of maximizing civilian casualties to break Japanese morale and force surrender. The language is clinical, strategic, devoid of moral consideration. General Curtis LeMay, who directed the campaign, later acknowledged, "If we'd lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals." The files documenting the planning, target selection criteria, and post-raid assessments include calculations of projected death tolls, optimal weather conditions for fire propagation, and evaluations of psychological impact. These documents remain classified or heavily redacted, not because they contain military secrets relevant to contemporary defense, but because they document a deliberate campaign of civilian annihilation that contravenes the laws of war and the moral framework the Allies claimed to defend. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki carry their own concealed history. Beyond the strategic debates about military necessity versus surrender negotiations, certain files remain locked that document the selection of target cities. Kyoto, Japan's ancient cultural capital, was initially the primary target for the first atomic bomb. It was chosen specifically because it had been spared conventional bombing, making it an ideal site to measure the weapon's full destructive potential without contamination of data by prior damage. Secretary of War Henry Stimson personally intervened to remove Kyoto from the target list due to its cultural significance, substituting Hiroshima. The files documenting this decision process, including discussions about demonstrating the bomb on an uninhabited area or providing advance warning to allow civilian evacuation, remain partially classified. The reasons for continued secrecy are unclear, but likely involve acknowledgement that alternatives to dropping atomic weapons on populated cities were considered and rejected for reasons beyond pure military necessity. More troubling are the files documenting human radiation experiments conducted on American citizens and military personnel during and after the war. Prisoners, hospital patients, pregnant women, and soldiers were deliberately exposed to radiation without informed consent to study the effects on human physiology. These experiments continued for decades after the war, funded by the Atomic Energy Commission and military intelligence services, their existence denied until whistleblowers and investigative journalists forced partial disclosures in the 1990s. The complete files, including the full scope of experiments, the names of all responsible officials, and the total number of victims, remain classified under national security provisions. The intelligence war produced its own hidden archives. The success of British codebreaking at Bletchley Park in cracking the German Enigma cipher is now celebrated history. Less known is the extent to which this intelligence advantage shaped strategic decisions that cost lives for the sake of maintaining secrecy. On November 14, 1940, British intelligence decrypted German Luftwaffe communications indicating a massive bombing raid planned against Coventry. Prime Minister Winston Churchill faced an impossible choice: evacuate the city and risk revealing that Enigma had been broken, or allow the raid to proceed with minimal defensive preparation. He chose the latter. Coventry burned, hundreds died. The medieval cathedral was destroyed. The secret of Ultra, the code name for intelligence derived from Enigma decrypts, was preserved. This pattern repeated throughout the war. Convoys were allowed to be attacked, Cities were left undefended. Troops were not warned of impending assaults, all to protect the source of intelligence. The files documenting these decisions, the calculations of acceptable losses measured against the strategic value of continued code-breaking access, remain among the most sensitive in British archives. They reveal a truth about modern warfare that contradicts comfortable narratives. Victory often requires commanders to sacrifice their own people deliberately, not through tactical error, but through calculated choice. The Soviet Union produced its own vast archive of concealed truth. The NKVD and later KGB maintained files on every aspect of Soviet wartime operations, including the catastrophic military failures of 1941-42 when German forces encircled and destroyed entire Soviet armies, capturing millions of prisoners. Stalin's purges of the Red Army's officer corps in the late 1930s had decapitated Soviet military leadership, leaving incompetent loyalists in command of critical operations. The files documenting Stalin's direct responsibility for these disasters, his refusal to heed intelligence warnings of the German invasion, and his orders that contributed to the deaths of millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians remain locked in Russian archives, accessible only to state-approved historians. More disturbing are the NKVD files documenting the Soviet security apparatus's treatment of its own soldiers. Soviet troops who survived German captivity were treated as traitors upon liberation, often sent directly from Nazi camps to Soviet gulags. Entire populations, Chechens, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, were deported en masse on suspicion of collaboration, with hundreds of thousands dying in transit or in exile. The files documenting these operations, the death tolls, and Stalin's direct orders remain classified, their contents known only through fragmentary disclosures and survivor testimonies. Intelligence cooperation between the Allies concealed troubling truths about the war's moral boundaries. The Soviet intelligence service ran extensive espionage networks within the United States and Britain, penetrating the Manhattan Project, the State Department, and British intelligence services. American and British counterintelligence services identified many of these agents during or immediately after the war, but chose not to prosecute or expose them to avoid embarrassing the governments involved or revealing the extent of their own counterintelligence capabilities. The files identifying these agents, their handlers, and the information they transmitted remain classified, protecting individuals who committed treason and the institutions that chose political convenience over justice. The Holocaust itself, humanity's greatest crime, carries concealed dimensions. The full extent of Allied knowledge about the death camps and the timing of that knowledge remains debated because key files remain classified or were destroyed. The Auschwitz bombing debate, whether the Allies could and should have bombed the gas chambers and railway lines leading to the camps, has been argued for decades, but certain intelligence assessments, operational feasibility studies, and policy discussions remain inaccessible. Similarly, files documenting the Roosevelt and Churchill administrations' decisions regarding Jewish refugees, immigration quotas, and responses to information about the final solution remain partially sealed, protected by national security classifications that seem increasingly indefensible as the decades pass. Switzerland's role as neutral banker to the Nazi regime produced vast archives that remain concealed. Swiss banks accepted gold looted from occupied nations and from Holocaust victims, providing crucial financial services that prolonged the Nazi war effort. After the war, these same institutions refused to return assets to survivors or their heirs, claiming lack of documentation that had been systematically destroyed by the Nazi regime. The full accounting of these transactions, the identities of Swiss officials who collaborated with Nazi financial operations, and the ultimate disposition of billions in looted assets remain hidden behind Swiss banking secrecy laws and diplomatic protections negotiated during post-war settlement agreements. The Vatican's wartime role remains similarly obscured. Pope Pius XII maintained diplomatic neutrality throughout the war, refusing to explicitly condemn the Holocaust or Nazi atrocities despite receiving detailed information from clergy and diplomatic sources. After the war, Vatican officials and Catholic clergy in Rome and across Europe facilitated escape routes, the Ratlins, for Nazi war criminals fleeing to South America. The files documenting Vatican knowledge of the Holocaust, the Pope's diplomatic calculations, and the Church's assistance to fleeing war criminals remain locked in Vatican archives, accessible only under restricted circumstances and subject to heavy redaction. The technologies of war produce their own secrets. Nazi Germany's advanced weapons programs, jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, chemical weapons, are well documented, but certain projects remain obscure. The Nazi Bell, or Die Glock, described in fragmentary post-war intelligence reports as an experimental propulsion or energy device, has spawned decades of speculation. Whether it was a real project involving exotic physics, a disinformation operation, or simply a misidentified conventional weapons program remains unclear because key files were either destroyed in the war's final days or remain classified in American, Soviet, and German archives. Japan's atomic weapons research program, which was more advanced than generally acknowledged, remains partially concealed. Japanese scientists were working on both uranium enrichment and plutonium extraction when the war ended. The full extent of this program, the locations of research facilities, and the disposition of radioactive materials and equipment after Japan's surrender are documented in files that remain classified in both American and Japanese archives, likely to avoid acknowledging how close Japan came to developing its own atomic bomb. The human cost of these secrets extends beyond the war itself. Veterans who were exposed to radiation, chemical weapons, or experimental drugs during the war were denied medical care and compensation for decades because acknowledging their exposure would require admitting the existence of classified programs. Japanese victims of Unit 730's biological warfare field tests received no recognition or assistance. Polish families were never able to properly mourn or memorialize the victims of Katyn because the truth was officially denied for 50 years. Holocaust survivors and their descendants fought for generations to recover stolen assets protected by banking secrecy laws. The psychological impact of sustained secrecy corroded institutions and public trust. When governments routinely classify information not to protect national security, but to avoid embarrassment, accountability, or legal liability, they undermine the foundations of democratic governance. The pattern established during World War II, classifying documents that reveal moral compromises, war crimes, or policy failures, became standard practice throughout the Cold War and continues today. The original justifications, protecting intelligence sources, preserving diplomatic relations, maintaining military advantage, have long since expired, yet the files remain sealed. Colonel Muller's burned fragment of paper, recovered in that frozen Belgian forest in January 1945, disappeared into the chaos of Germany's collapse. Whether he understood its significance before his death, the records do not say if he survived the war, remains unknown. But that single piece of charred paper represented a larger truth. The Second World War was fought not only with armies and weapons but with secrets, and some of those secrets were deemed so dangerous that they would be protected long after the war's end, hidden from historians, survivors, and the public that had sacrificed so much for victory. The most dangerous secret files of World War II remain hidden not because they protect current military capabilities or intelligence methods, but because they document moral failures, strategic compromises, and crimes committed by the victors as well as the vanquished. They reveal that the good war required its own moral sacrifices, that victory was purchased not only with courage and sacrifice, but with deliberate choices to prioritize strategic advantage over justice, to grant immunity to war criminals for their knowledge, to conceal atrocities for political convenience, and to classify evidence of those decisions to protect institutions and individuals from accountability.